black people are not a monolith. You've probably been told this at some point in your life, or well, most likely if you live in the US you've been told about this. God knows I was never told about it until recently. It's a pretty handy, correct even, shortcut for saying something that most people who are in dipshits will agree with. Black people aren't one the same. Just because there is a sexist black person, or a transphobic black person, or even a racist black person, doesn't mean that all of them are. And if you act as if such a thing is true, then you're probably just a racist dipshit. I'm not interested in this video in acting as if that is true. Black people are, indeed, not a monolith. So, imagine my shock, right? When black Americans, right? When black Americans on social media decide to ignore all of the supposed principles out of thin air. Chapter 1. The one in which a bunch of black Americans treat Latin Americans as a monolith. Not going to lie, when writing this video I want to be very careful in advance, so I will preemptively clarify this. If I ever speak in this video about black Americans as a general group, or speak about this issue I've noticed in the general community in general, that does not mean that I think that all black Americans personally believe these things, or that all black Americans participate in this. One of the reasons I am making this video is precisely because I'm sure black American voices who are reasonable are out there. And I would like to not only offer my perspective on this generally complicated topic, but also to hear out these voices from the black community. And by the way, when I say specifically black Americans, I say it for a reason, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. Also, I would preemptively give the disclaimer that, socially, in my home country of Uruguay, I am white. I will get later into what exactly that means, because a lot of you may be imagining something that I'm not, but we'll get into that later. All of this to say, when it comes to time to discuss what racism looks like and how it manifests in my home country, I only have such a thing as my personal experience about it, but if you're a black voice within Uruguay or even a black voice within Latin America, by all means, share your perspective. Now, with all that out of the way, Americans, we need to talk. As you've seen from the montage earlier, recently there was a discussion going on Twitter, which largely centered around the discussion between Latin Americans and black Americans. Now, Twitter being Twitter, and for the interest of fairness, it wasn't just black Americans being generally racist towards Latin Americans by acting like Latin Americans are a monolith. As we'll discuss soon, there were, and also are, a lot of Latin American racists sharing their opinions, which I'll have right up on screen here. As you may have noticed by my tone, I have no interest in defending these horribly racist comments, but I do want to argue something. Just the same way that we are expected to not treat black people as a monolith, why were these accounts from black Americans actually talking about Latin America as if it were a monolith too? Is fighting fire with fire exactly the best thing you can do about these individual people being racist? I'm sure someone would point to me to a similar montage to the one I made of Latin American people being generally racist. But would this exactly prove me wrong? Or will it just prove that you're treating Latin American people as a monolith? And like, one thing I have to say, right, on account of being Latin American, treating us as a monolith is honestly offensive? Disgusting, even. It's no secret, in fact, it's barely even a secret, that Latino, as Americans like to categorize us, is not and should not be treated as a race or even a homogeneous culture. Not even close. There are many groups of Latinos within Latin America. There are white Latinos, Afro-Latinos, indigenous Latinos, cholos, mulatos, mestizos, criollos, acting as if Latin Americans, and in particular specific countries too, we'll get to that, are all racist. It's not only disgusting in and of itself, but it's also taken for granted that all Latinos are white, which is just straight up being racist. Not to mention, treating such a broad group of people such as Latin American people, who come from a variety of very different societal circumstances, as a predictable political demographic, is also just straight up being misguided. Latin Americans from different realities don't exactly have the same social and economic realities that shape them. Politically, A Uruguayan who has been made middle class thanks to Frente Amplio's welfare policies is not the same as a Venezuelan who gets radicalized against left-wing politics because the only thing they were taught to view as left-wing was the same ruling class that ruined their country. And look, I get why black Americans worry about the conditions of black people within Argentina, Uruguay, and other countries. At the same time, black Americans, for the most part, have not ever stepped soil, read about, or even experienced racism in these countries. And I'm tired of pretending that because of their status as black Americans, they get to be legitimate voices, because they're fucking not. Now, I know you little people inside my phone. I know what you're about to say. How dare I, a white person, dare to speak of what is and isn't racism? And maybe, under these circumstances, I'd agree, but I want you to take this into account. In Latin America, or at least in my high school in Uruguay, and I assume in many schools across South America, we get to not only learn of our complicated history with racism and other relevant historical events, like some US interventions, but we also get to learn about Jim Crow. We get to learn about the Holocaust, about World War II, about many events in US and European history. Do Americans get to learn about Plan Condor, about how the US financially and with training supported extermination campaigns that killed not just white people across many South American countries, but black and indigenous populations? Do Americans get to learn about the massacre of Salsipuedes in Uruguay, events that exterminated the indigenous Charrúa population, or about the complicated history of racism these countries have and how it If the answer is no, and I'm sure 99.9% sure it isn't, then shut the fuck up, you stupid gringo, and listen to someone who actually knows about this shit. Chapter 2. Racism works differently in South America, gringo. Now, as with the previous disclaimers, I will mostly be talking about how racism works across mostly Uruguay, but I will be consulting with friends from other locations in South America, so this is as broad as possible with an analysis. Regardless, it is important to remember to not treat something as complicated as racism as something that happens the same way in all places. So if there are some details wrong and you actually have lived experience being in South America, or you have done the reading, then please, by all means, take the stage in the comments. Good? Good. Now, if you're South American and have ever been to the US, I'm sure there's something you may have noticed which is very interesting to say at least. And let me describe what I'm about to say with an anecdote my dad shared once about the time he was hired to work in the US. Now, the details are not exactly relevant, but around 2005, my dad, who is a university professor, he specified university, not college professor, was granted a job in the US. One of the things they had him do to take such a job was fill in a list of races which race he felt corresponded the most to him. Being that locally in Uruguay we are considered white, naturally he filled in white. So a couple of months passed and they called him back. Turns out they called him because there must have been a mistake. You see, the job position they were offering was not meant for white people. When he explained that his grandparents, and in turn my great-grandparents, were from Spain, they explained to him that actually makes him a Hispanic Latino and made him fill in that checkbox to get the job. Now, why am I telling you this? Is it because white people don't exist in Latin America? No, not at all. It's actually because this confusion that was caused, I think, is a perfect example of how race and in turn racism work different across South America and the US. Or well, at least the US and Uruguay. For one, we have to remember which countries were colonizers, which eventually led to the US and Latin America and how racism works in those countries. Speaking about European racism, it's no secret to anyone who knows their history that inside Europe, despite anyone from outside generally considering them white, inside Europe, there is a divide in how Europeans see their whiteness. In fact, that's literally what led to, I don't know, Nazism? Specifically, the ways that countries in Northern European region view their race, where Northern Europeans, Great Britain, France, Germany, the Nordic countries, they are white, while the Southern European countries are something else, they're Mediterraneans, you see. And this divide in races is precisely carried to the US, the broader Anglo-speaking world, and to the Spanish colonies. In fact, these countries as a whole have very different racial systems from one another in their colonial times. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the Spanish caste system by now. A lot of English YouTubers talk about it. Even history YouTubers have no fucking business talking about it. And these historical conditions themselves obviously led to very different views on race in the present and therefore racism. Something you may have noticed that's also a bit weird, for example, is how a lot of Latin Americans seem to be picky about who is actually a Latino, and this is one of the main differences we have to talk about here. If you came to Uruguay one day and magically could speak the language and could tell a Uruguayan person that you're Italo-Uruguayan, they'd probably look at you weird. This isn't something that only manifests in Uruguay. This is also in general how race and identity is viewed, not just in the Hispanic side of South America, but even in almost the entirety of Brazil. In South America, identity isn't really viewed as this thing where if you have an ancestor from, say, Spain, let's say a great-grandparent, you're suddenly Hispanic country. You're just from the country you're born from. The way we understand identity usually, it requires not simply to be born on that soil, or even to have a dense ancestor from 100 years ago. It requires you to have a connection to the culture, speak the language, live amongst us, and even understand our complex material reality in the third world. This is why you will often find Americans saying that they have Latino representation in X thing, and what they mean to say is that the person has ancestors from Latin America, and Latin Americans will get mad at you because that is not what we mean by that. And in many ways, I'm sorry to say, while these systems are certainly different, and treating one as superior to the other is silly because they're both arbitrary, I also have to say that not only do I find the US system foreign, but also deeply arbitrary and stupid. So you're telling me this, right? You're not American, you're Italian American because your great-granddad was Italian, but that's kind of arbitrary, right? First of all, you have more ancestors than just one great-grandparent, some of whom might be from other places. And also, those ancestors have ancestors themselves. So if we apply the same logic, they are part that, I guess, and also you are partly of what those ancestors of those ancestors were. But those ancestors of your ancestors have ancestors themselves. Under this logic, eventually we will find the ultimate ethnic truth about the world, which is that we're all 100% African, which is where the first Australopithecus originated from. We could take this one step further actually. We are 100% prokaryotic cells ethnically. Go back further, and we are 100% cosmic dust. The ultimate ethnic truth is the Big Bang. Obviously, this is just my opinion. I don't want to police how others view their own identity. But at the same time, I do want to caution Americans against the idea, especially when it's in terms of the global south, that you are somewhat qualified to speak about the specific country because you had ancestors like that. Especially if you don't speak the language, know the culture, or even set foot on your motherland soil. And this is just one example of how race and identity manifests differently in South America and the US. Let's go into other such examples. Most countries in Latin America, as a matter of fact, did not have Jim Crow style segregation. This isn't to say Latin American countries did not have racism at all, in fact, they did and do. And something that personally infuriates me is the absurd lengths that some of the governments in Latin America will go through to excuse their historic and current racism. Because yes, Latin American countries have had racist governments and or racists running governments. That is so true. Does that mean that all people within these countries are racist? No, not really. I am personally an anarchist. I don't have any personal connections to any Latin American state, therefore I can acknowledge the fact that these states have committed crimes against humanity, some with US involvement, some without. In my home country, for example, there was the massacre of Salsipuedes. Literally get out if you can. A massacre which was perpetrated by at the time President Fructuoso Rivera. Rivera nowadays is nationally celebrated. There is a whole department named after him, and one of the most important avenues in Montevideo, Avenida General Rivera, is named after him. This is actually one of the few things where racism manifests similarly to the US, the general white supremacism of these countries, and the lengths that the states are willing to go to defend those atrocious acts. I personally campaigned in the past for Avenida General Rivera to be renamed Avenida Ushnusa, one of Rivera's victims, who, get this, was literally sent to France alive to be part of a museum exhibit. You cannot make this up. But regardless of what I, or other Uruguayans who are on the side of human life, think about Fructuoso Rivera, the Montevideo Intendencia government disagreed, and excused a straight-up racist in the name of him being important to the history of Uruguayan independence. This was written by the people in the Frente Amplio government. They call themselves left-wing. However, I still argue that despite things like these, racism still manifests quite differently across Uruguay and many Latin American countries actually. It's quite hard to explain without resorting to lived experience. Just for your knowledge, however, I am having this section heavily scrutinized by other Latin Americans reading the script. Racism is actually intertwined a lot more with class, and especially a lot more than the US. It's not as much of a phrenology type thing. In Uruguay, and in a lot of South American countries in fact, it's possible to be physiologically more black than someone who would be considered black in the US, but still be considered white, not only by others but by oneself. The reason for this is actually because races and racism, both being social constructs, manifest differently as a whole. And this is because of what I said of its relation to class. In Uruguay, if you live in a middle-class neighborhood, speak properly, dress like a middle-class person, and are subject to the same culture as white Uruguayans, you would most likely be considered white. It's a bit complicated for sure. Colorism does play a small part. You can be too black for your class to make you pass as white, but generally, that is how it works. This also means, subsequently, that you can be what otherwise would be a white person in other places and be considered black socially in Uruguay. Racism is also a lot more silent and hidden. That's not to say police brutality doesn't occur, because it does, especially of black homeless people. Not to mention, people who live in asentamientos in Montevideo. But unlike in the US, where you could have the white supremacists who yell the N-word at black people, the way racism looks like for most people who do it is that they see a black person sleeping on the street, walking by, or any other thing, and they swap to the other side of the road. There's a general fear of black people, which is caused as much of the stigma of being seen as black as it is for the stigma of being poor, and therefore being associated with delinquents. As an example of this, just look at me. I, in Uruguay, are very firmly considered white, but I think it's pretty hard to argue that I'd also be white under US standards. In fact, I probably would be a stereotypical Latino or a mestizo. I even have US friends who have told me as such, but I am socially white in Uruguay. Slurs also don't work the same way, and a lot of black Americans laughed at me about this, but it is unambiguously true. There are words that are offensive when you say them in a specific context or to specific people, but there aren't prohibited words that a specific group can only use and reclaim, and anyone else using is a horrible monster for doing so. In fact, let's talk about one such word in Uruguay, pichi. Pichi, specifically the way I'm pronouncing it, is an insult towards poor, usually black, people. As you can hear me, I'm saying the word right now because it is not offensive to just directly say it. It would be offensive if I directly called one such person that. The word originates from Mapudungun pichi, meaning small. The slur, if we can even call it that, also sounds like Spanish pichi, which really means piss, which I'm sure to the average Uruguayan racist adds to the racist connotations. Also, in general, just the term slur in English having no literal translation in Spanish and Portuguese, that's also why slur works differently. Have you ever wondered why census data in Uruguay says that it's the whitest country in the region, with 88% of the population considering themselves white? It's not because we are all ethnically pure, blonde, Aryan blue-eyed people. It's because precisely, Uruguay, having the biggest middle class across all of the countries in South America, precisely created the conditions for people in the country to socially consider themselves white. The census data, by the way, is collecting by asking the respondent what their race is. This is one of the many reasons why you should always be skeptical of when people look at census data for, say, Argentina, and particularly the ways in which people like to use such census data to make the case for black erasure happening within the country, because race in and of itself works inherently differently, and as Argentina in general turned middle class, so did it turn white. But, of course, nothing is ever simple, because while what I just argued I think is true, in general, we should perhaps zoom out of the southern cone region for a second and talk about that Europeanness that Uruguay and Argentina have. That's right, baby, we're gonna talk about how Latin Americans are racist to each other. Chapter 3. Racism between Latin Americans. So I'm sure this chapter will piss off a lot of Uruguayan and Argentine nationalists. And honestly, if it does, get a fucking grip. One thing that often Uruguayans and Argentine people would argue, and sometimes even people outside of these regions perhaps ask if it's true, is that these countries in Latin America are more European than the rest. And boy, do I have a lot of stuff to talk about here. I can't speak as much for how it is in Argentina, but I will talk about how I've seen it manifest over there. But my analysis will, once again, be mostly focused on Uruguay. Though it is also worth mentioning that this isn't a phenomenon unique to Hispanic America. This also happens with some Brazilians, who also hold this idea of being more European than the rest of Brazil. But in general, I just want to talk about something pretty interesting to me. In the same way that there is such a thing as US exceptionalism, a thing that hurts most of the world and exists purely because of the US racial mythos, so exists the much less harmless, but still really harmful and very real Uruguayan mythos, with its own Uruguayan exceptionalism. And let me tell you, the Uruguayan mythos is honestly just a bunch of bullshit people use to justify being racist towards the rest of Latin America. Again, this also happens in Argentina, though I don't feel entitled to speak about how it manifests there. But the general beliefs that are held by Uruguayans are generally also held by Argentine people and southern Brazilians. That because we have very European architecture, and the biggest signifiers of equality and prosperity in the region, with some of the highest living conditions, we are somehow not Latino. You see, we're not like them, our barbarous Latin American neighbors. We are more sophisticated, more educated, more white. In general, I think the Uruguayan mythos is held together by one common myth, a phrase that is said by many Uruguayans. We are not Latin American, we are the Switzerland of the Americas. We had so much historic European immigration. Our culture is a melting pot of different European peoples. I told you we are European, right? I didn't forget that? Jokes aside, this is one of the biggest parts of the Uruguayan mythos. So much so that even one of my favorite bands, a band from Uruguay, El Cuarteto de Nos, they got back in the 90s an incredibly racist song called We Are Not Latinos, No Somos Latinos, in which the chorus sings, and like, you know, they're still my favorite band for other non-racist reasons, but like, that is really racist. Anyway, back on track. Okay, wait, before we get back on track, I don't think that I explained exactly, well, not just many other parts of the Uruguayan mythos, but also a unifying thing in our country and in Latin American culture of all these countries and how racism also tends to occur. Something that people outside of South America, who am I kidding, people outside of Uruguay don't know, is that, after all, Uruguay is not just the Switzerland of the South, it's also Uruguayos campeones de América y del mundo. Because, as we say in Uruguay, vamos arriba la celeste, vamos desde el cerro Bella Unión. Football is something that is deeply tied to the Uruguayan national mythos, but also in general something that is culturally shared across all these countries, and also one of the main ways racism manifests between these countries as well. And this is where I have to intervene to say that, sorry my Uruguayan pals, we are not campeones de América del mundo. We cannot stop being that when other countries caught up to our already artificially inflated World Cup count, and when Argentina beat Brazil last Copa America. So we're not even campeones de América. By the way, I absolutely am aware that I'm stepping on a giant foot here by having explicitly brought up two Jaime Ross tracks back to back. Needless to say, the same way I can talk about how El Cuarteto is a band that I personally love, but they made that extremely racist song, so can I recognize that Jaime Ross, despite contributing to the general ego of the region and the nationalist fervor people get from Uruguayan football, is probably not racist. I don't know, I didn't check, and I'm not interested in launching accusations of someone being a racist on a personal level, unless they are Nazis or something. And by the way, I would just like to note that this is incredibly racist that the Uruguayan government whitewashes the wiping of the Charruan people. Meanwhile, the average Uruguayan person calls the Uruguayan football team not just La Celeste, but also La Garra Charrúa. Oh, the racism. El Loco chipped the ball more than 15 years ago, guys. Please let it go. We have not made it to the elimination round in the last two World Cups. Stop coping and pay attention to the actual prompts around you, please. Small but powerful? Small but lame pelotas. This general belief of superiorness that Uruguayans, Argentines, and some Brazilians have doesn't just mean that they believe themselves to be superior to others within Latin America, it also means that, while this doesn't apply to everyone living in these conditions, there tends to be a lot of racism that usually manifests itself more specifically as xenophobia. Actually, this is one of the main ways racism exhibits itself in Latin America. It's so common, in fact, that you can see patterns of countries that people are generally xenophobic towards because of this. But it's not just the uses of these countries that make xenophobia happen. That's making a complex issue be a lot simpler than it actually is. It's also because of what we mentioned before partially. Class in a lot of these regions in general is partially, but not completely, tied to race. This is why if you ask any common racist in Uruguay, Chile, or Peru, the common suspects will pop up for the same reasons. Venezuelan immigrants fleeing the conditions of the country are generally hated by racists locally. So are Cuban immigrants, and depending on the country, sometimes also Bolivians or Paraguayan immigrants. This is precisely because of the stigmatization that people from said regions have in each country, that Venezuelans are just poor, that Cubans are just poor, that Bolivians are... you get the idea. And this is really important, right? This racism that happens between countries, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, is just as much about colorism as it is about class, or well, the perception of just being poor. There is a term locally for this phenomenon. Classism is a correct way to describe it, but people also use the term aporophobia. And this is to say, right, that these stereotypes can work the other way as well. Across non-Southern countries, there is a general stigma that Argentine people, especially, but Uruguayan people to an extent too, are just mega racists. They're cold, they're bad, but obviously, and I hope you say this with me now, Argentine and Uruguayan people are not a monolith. The last thing I mentioned, this stigma, particularly towards Argentina, is something that a lot of Americans like to use to generally just slander a country they don't know anything about. They'll act like the country is more racist than the actual US, which is not true, come on, don't be fucking silly. And after this entire journey, the last thing I mentioned is key to everything. Chapter 4. Americans feel entitled to speak about foreign racism that they know so little about. All of this brings us full circle. I want to start this chapter by asking a simple question. Surely being that racism manifests so differently in Latin America, surely Americans would have the humility to listen to us when we talk about its nuances, how it functions culturally, how it materially affects people, etc. Well, yeah, of course, the American people have a lot of humility after all. Of course not! A lot of Americans, and I know I'm walking on eggshells here, so bear with me. A lot of Americans, and in particular Black Americans, after a tweet by fellow creator Pillboy, who has made a very good video in the past talking about the complex relations between people in the diaspora, you should check it out, decided that, after making up the meaning of what our own word, gringo, means, that wasn't enough. They decided to talk about racism in Latin America. There was a lot of misinformation, a genuinely huge hate campaign against Argentina that also had a lot of misinformation, and in general just denial. Denial of a sentiment being shared across Latin America Twitter in response to these accusations. That Black Americans benefit from living in the imperial core, the United States. Okay. So, back up for a moment. I know how this sounds. Under other circumstances, you think this is something that a genuine racist would say. Like a white supremacist talking about how the US is so great and how they're a black person be ungrateful. That is not what I mean to say. I think I made it quite obvious by now that they take racism as an issue very seriously. None of what I said up to now, or what I will say following this, is a means to deny the fact that Black Americans suffer from horrific acts of racism themselves. If you speak to any Black American, you know what ICE is doing in the US to Black Americans. You know Black Americans, to this day, still get lynched, not unlike the days of the KKK. In fact, it makes them libelous even, to suggest that Black Americans benefit from US imperialism, when the US Empire has done acts of terrorism against Black Americans themselves. Here's a little bit of Black American history for you. Look up the 1985 MOOB bombings on your own time. It's genuinely horrifying. What I'm trying to talk about here isn't something as preposterous as that. It's rather something that I feel we need to understand about dynamics on the world stage, because otherwise if we don't, we risk committing the same mistakes that past generations that tried to liberate all people have made. I'm not trying to deny that US imperialism harms black Americans. It clearly does, as I've shown. But it's not untrue that it benefits them either. It's not like a net loss or gain thing, because I think actually death is the biggest thing you could lose over the benefits I am about to speak of. My point, and I do have one, is by no means that when they say that black Americans benefit from living in the imperial core in directly provable ways, are they privileged and therefore should not be listened. Privilege is in fact something that many of us have to an extent. That is what intersectionality was meant to explain. Intersectionality isn't so you can make a contest of who is the most oppressed person. I am black, but you're black and a woman, therefore you must be more oppressed than me and your voice matters more. That is not how it works. Intersectionality is a way of understanding that like streets intersect with one another, creating an intersection, not only do the oppression streets intersect creating new oppression to intersections, so does our privileged streets, making our oppression all the more complicated, because its privileged streets, overall, change how our oppression happens. And black Americans, like all Americans, do receive benefits from living in the imperial core. Acknowledging this does not mean not acknowledging their oppression. It means that if you're black American trying to make an international movement, you should consider this privilege because overall, yes, in some specific respects, you're talking from above to many Latin Americans. That position should not be used to, I don't know, bargain better rights for you while others still have their issues unsolved. Now, I know some Americans in the audience might object to this, that black Americans don't receive any imperial benefits actually. I'm sorry I have to do this. Allow me to explain to you why not just black Americans receive imperial benefits, but all Americans receive imperial benefits. You don't need to be personally paid the imperial profits in order to benefit from US imperialism. In fact, imperial profiteering in the imperial core is mostly tacit, indirect, or rather than those things, it's things that may seem so normal, so mundane, so common, that it's hard to see them as profiteering until you put them in a global context, but nonetheless, they are profiteering. I want you, if you're American, to look around you right now. If you're a homeowner in the US, look at whatever souvenirs you have, look at whatever hardware you have, look at your fridge and the food within it. If you're homeless, I'm sure some of you might be. Look at your streets, at the buildings, whatever money you use to survive. These realities are very different, and I'd argue a homeless person is generally pretty oppressed as a whole, certainly more oppressed than me. But what you're witnessing around you only exists because of third world extraction, not for any other reason. I want you to think about that for a second. The food in the fridge? Usually kept cheap and abundant in US markets because food products are extracted from the global south. The hardware? It's no secret that chips in general have minerals that people in the Congo have to mine out in very precarious conditions. The souvenirs? Kept cheap for the same reasons. Your streets? Made with money that comes from US extraction. Please don't forget that the US relation to the rest of the world is parasitic, there's no other way to put it. Your buildings? Same as the last one. If you have enough luck to be able to have one of those, your passport lets you travel all across the world, whereas someone in the global south will need to get a visa. And guess what too? The systemic discrimination that black Americans face, also funded by US extraction. ICE, the CIA, the FBI. Again, this isn't to say that black Americans have it better than the global south in absolutely all instances. That's an oppression competition that I am not interested in fighting in. But as someone who lives in the global south, and please keep in mind I live in a relatively privileged country in the region, unfortunately, I know these things are a privilege, all too well. I get to see my Uruguayan brethren, the people who live in Malvin Norte, or perhaps even Cerro Norte, or many other neighborhoods in Montevideo, which, need I remind you, is the capital of Uruguay. I get to see that asphalt streets are a luxury they can't afford, or clean tap water. Their water is actually usually dirty. Their homes, built with scrap metal and other garbage materials, they are constantly exposed to lead and other dangerous substances. The Uruguayan state has been silently ignoring their existence for more than 30 years. And, to be quite frank, yes, it may be because they don't care about the poor black people, but it may also be because is there anything they can do about it? Anything they can do when they are under the thumb of the global hegemon to keep it like this. Chapter 5. North and Global South Relations. Around the 1970s, the US government funded and directly trained the juntas that would eventually form Operation Condor, coups of nations in Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, and later, following the same line but not officially being a part of Operation Condor, Peru. Locally, with said countries, it was made in the name of protecting the nature of these states, protecting their Judeo-Christian values, protecting it from subversivos. It was in fact not all about that. Prior to the 1970s, most if not all of these countries were making very quick strides in improving living conditions for the poor and marginalized within their internal countries. The rise of Juan Domingo Perón in making Argentina an industrial powerhouse, Uruguay following in their footsteps with José Bacheverres and their light industry, Brazil doing the same under Getúlio Vargas. These governments were by no means perfect. Some of them had glaring issues which I've spoken about, but they did generally empower the marginalized people of these countries and improve their living conditions, and it made Latin American people realize that maybe we can do better. When these economic nationalist movements failed for their own individual reasons, revolutionary groups started popping up. The Movimiento de Liberación Nacional Tupamaros in Uruguay, the Montoneros in Argentina. These groups were suppressed by their respective states completely before the coups were declared, but something did not sit right with the elites of these individual countries, who benefited from the same systems as US capital does. It could happen again. In fact, how can they be so sure they can protect their economic interests if people are still protesting on the streets? This led to some of the biggest acts of state repression across all of these countries, with an estimated 30,000 people having not just been murdered, but being erased. Or, as we say it, being desaparecido. This was not just white Latinos, it was Afro-Latinos, indigenous Latinos, or in general, anyone who... The real reason why Plan Condor happened was not because of any internal history of these countries, at least, not completely. It was an affront on the people who looked at the situation of people like I've talked about, people in asentamientos, and decided they wanted to help those people. For all intents and purposes, Plan Condor wasn't just so the average American would stay wealthy and still the center of the world, it was so also the poor people in these countries, the countries the US benefited of their misery, stayed that way, and stayed they did for another 40 years. Americans, if you have any humility, if you genuinely care about worldwide suffering and not just looking at your own belly button, take this as a cautionary tale. Just because your material situation benefits locally does not mean you're making the most of good in the world. US politics are almost exclusively framed about the rights of Americans, even within some left-wingers, hell, especially with left-wingers. But please keep in mind, not for a future election, but for the future in general, getting universal healthcare, or getting free college, or getting any welfare state improvements does not mean you're helping everyone. In fact, a first world welfare state requires these hierarchies to even exist. Just because you can talk about the material situation of other people in other countries doesn't mean you should. In fact, from your position, it might even be a form of imperialism in and of itself. Bonus chapter: Anti-Argentine Racism. This was not originally part of the script. Originally, I had written this video before all of this happened. However, due to all that I've seen happening lately from all around the world, no, I don't think I can let this slide. Following the events of the Black Americans versus Global South folk discussing about this, and the progression of the World Cup, there has been an uptick recently on racism against Argentines. Some of you may be confused here. It's pretty societally accepted right now to talk shit against Argentines, for what people would consider a variety of reasons. However, I want you to think if perhaps this blind rage and hatred that is going on against Argentines could be serving a purpose, perhaps even serve a kind of manufactured consent? But we'll get to that in a bit. If you go on social media, Twitter, TikTok, many other places, you'll see news of apparently there being this huge racism problem in Argentina, and as we've discussed, yeah, some, but not all Argentines have superiority complex going on. People saying this will often cite things happening because of the World Cup and people being generally racist.
Did you know that Argentina has a serious racism problem? Because no the fuck, I did not. The videos that you guys have been sending me this week have been nothing shy of disgusting, to the extent to where as a black woman myself, I will never go to Argentina. Are you guys aware that once the World Cup is over, the world is going to remember all the shit that you guys did? From calling Jude Bellingham the N-word, from screaming racial slurs, to fans calling Vinicius a monkey.
Junior! Vinicius! 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 ¡Vas a electrocutar, Vinicius!
Some of you sent me a video of Argentina fans chanting racist slurs on a bus. Now I'm sure you guys have seen the clips of Aisho Speed getting racially harassed or just having things thrown directly at him whilst at the England-Argentina game. And the worst part is that is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Argentina supporters or Argentina in general in terms of being blatantly racist. Go onto Twitter and you'll see so much more. And listen, I'm not even necessarily trying to call the entire country out because I'm sure not every person from Argentina is like this. I'm sure that's not the case. But as a black woman watching the World Cup, seeing how you guys have been acting, yeah, it's not a good look. When all of this evidence is so damning, I'm sorry, but it's not a good look. Not for your country.
People will also make the claim that Argentina is Israeli or a white ethno state. People have also talked about Argentina having a Zionist president, and in general characterizing all Argentines as racists because of whatever reason they want to use to justify making blanket statements. I want to mention, I do not condone Argentines who are racist as the World Cup. I don't condone Milei. I don't condone actual white supremacist states that might be out there. But all of this hatred, which people have used and are using to make blanket statements about Argentines as a whole, to the point that people have come out in real life with stories of being discriminated against in person, this is not fighting against racism. Making blanket statements about Argentina being anti-black or Zionist or all Argentines being racist is in and of itself racist. Simply put, Argentine people are not a monolith, as we said. And not only are some Argentines black or indigenous, but also some of them deeply care about racism and are themselves anti-racists. Holding Argentines accountable, whatever the fuck that means, for what other Argentines have had nothing to do with them have done is a problem. And this is further made worse with the fact that Argentina has a population of 45 million people. This video showed earlier, for example, is by a black woman who, I get it, I get why concern of racism might be happening, but this woman decided that 45 million people must live in a society with a huge racism problem because she saw at most 50 people, including an actual child, be racist. Argentina does have problems with racism. I will not and would never deny that. But to make it out to be a white supremacist state, or to think it's especially racist compared to the entire world, is stupid. And especially when it's first worlders saying this, when they live in countries that had colonies with literal slavery. This campaign of massive generalization and dehumanization raised some suspicions among some people in the region, and this is when I have to introduce you to why this dehumanization campaign happened. Allow me to introduce you to Honduras Gate. At the same time that this massive campaign was happening, there was an alleged leak of President Donald Trump talking to multiple South American presidents. According to the Wikipedia article, the audio supposedly talk about a plan to interfere in Honduras and other South American countries' politics. While this was happening, the Argentine government has been selling Patagonian land to Israel and the US, which the leaks allegedly also confirm close ties to Israel for the project. And it's not just that the Argentine government has been selling land, they've also been heavily promoting this. There are many other things, like a lot of Latin American governments agreeing to sell private citizen data to Israel, that seem to confirm one thing. This massive campaign against Argentina might have not been an accident. It might have actually been deliberately manufactured to create manufacturer consent for the future idea of an occupation of Patagonia, possibly to create a new ethno-state. I hope you guys remember 9/11 and how consent was manufactured for the war on terror through a terrorist and the dehumanization campaign of all Muslims. Not that the hate campaign would have been justified if this is the case, but I want you to think honestly here. Does dehumanizing a whole group of people in a racist manner not allow and manufacture consent for these exact types of things? This ultimately to me proves generally that left-leaning people who might otherwise be opposed to racism can be made to think like a dehumanizing racist if given woke reasons for it. And what better way to create consent for imperialism than getting the people who would otherwise be opposed to you on board to do it? And I understand why there might be concerns about racism. But I can tell you matter-of-factly that Argentina is a normal country that, like any other state, has history with racism, and its people are normal people. And like anywhere else that you go in the world, some of them may be racist. There's absolutely nothing uniquely evil about Argentine racism, even if it does exist. We talked about a lot of things here. How racism manifests across Latin America, how the US benefits from these conditions. All of that. But I don't want to leave this video on such a sour note. We shouldn't feel bad because things are like this. Recognizing it is, in my opinion, the first step in knowing how to fight these power structures for a better future for everyone. And please listen to marginalized voices in the Global South. Listen to Latin Americans when we talk about racism. In fact, I'd like to share with you some testimonies from Latin American friends across Latin America.
Hi guys, EMF here. Here we have the world's biggest brown supremacist. I'm back again, and today we'll talk about Peruvian racism. Yay! Peru's a brown, and yes, mostly cholo country. Despite being one myself, what it constitutes one in the modern day, don't look at those old caste system era graphics. I still hold, let's call, Criollo characteristics. I use the vernacular Spanish of my city, Lima. I speak an Alemanian accent too. I've consumed and have knowledge of Criollo culture. I have access to first world living conditions for my entire life. So, I'm hegemonically white, right? So privileged on your end. Error! This is because racism here works in spectrums. Pigmentocracy, in short words, is that the closer you are to Criollo, or even better, European, the more pure you are. And racism is usually manifested in virtue signaling, not just skin color and oh my god, it's purity politics if we became racism. I'm gonna kill myself. My phenotype is fairly indigenous. I've faced racism for the way I look. I've faced discrimination for the mere ability of speaking English while being brown. God forbid. I've been compared to low-income jobs because that's sadly the reality of a lot of province immigrants. All of them. Because I don't qualify for the standard of what constitutes white enough for my presence to be well regarded in some spaces. Spaces where, well, there are brown people. The same ones who are enforcing these racial roles. But hey, they at least don't pretend they are more than just a mere cholo. See how there's much more nuance? See how it's tied to culture and knowledge? Please, if you're gonna talk about the racial reality of our countries, at least know it was closely tied to our forced indigenous rape and bettering the race of the local population, and not segregation. Thinking the same structures of power that were constructed also apply in Latin America is just ignorant, and also, in my opinion, kinda racist.
Hi, I'm Cass. I'm doing this for a curious video, yay! So, when it comes to racism in Mexico, I will say that it is definitely a thing that happens here, but I wouldn't say, or at least I don't think that it is practiced or expressed in the same way that it is in the United States. And I'd say this because mainly, rather different that in the United States, unlike the United States, where you have people coming from completely different origins. You have black people, Asians, or natives that come from completely different places. When it comes to Mexico, what you do have a lot of variation, when it comes to like different societies, different communities, definitely different like skin colors or um, genetical stuff. You are technically still considered to be a Mexican, so that is rarely to be it's going to be rare that you face a distinction uh, for this reason, for race, as you will use the term. I will personally say that here in Mexico, it has way more to do with your social class than it does with your race. As I said previously, I wouldn't say that racism itself, or at least skin color, at least here, is in a factor. But I will say that it comes down to more economic, stuff. I will say that it comes way more to your economic status. And take this because, well, this is based on my own experience. I can say that, for example, let's take as an example, like slurs or stuff like that. I will say that you will have you will really have like a distinctive slur, a distinctive word that people will use in order to discriminate you or like ridicule you or make fun of you. Uh, and again, this comes because the main reason here in Mexico is obviously economic disparity. So personally, me, I've always lived in rough neighborhoods. The area where I live here in New Juarez, it is considered to be the pretty much most violent, dangerous area here. So obviously, you're gonna have a lot of issues when it comes to education. You're gonna have like a way lesser education than other places. And I don't want to say this just to be a jerk. I want to say this because, because you have like very poor education and very poor culture in a place like the one where I live. People are going to be jerks. People are going to be like pretty much pieces of shit. So, um, I remember, for example, ever since I was a kid, I remember, every time that I was in class, I will try to like interact with the other kids, and they will be like completely, how do I say this? I would say that they will be completely crude, for their age, saying like, cuss words, kind of like slurs and stuff, and you know, from what I've seen, from what I've experienced, from all the different insults and stuff that I've heard, uh, you will rarely hear something related to race itself. You will hear stuff, related to color, but as I said previously, uh, it is not considered to be a different race, at least in here. So, uh, so people in here, people in Mexico, will obviously treat these things very differently. I will use as an experience, as a personal experience. I remember that in high school, I have like a group that had like very, 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 very people. There was like a guy that was, pretty much dark skinned. There was someone else who had like very Asian features or something, and there was one of them which was pretty much white. He had a very pale skin, and then you have me, who I'm technically pale, technically a white skin, but I'm just suntan, as a lot of people in here. So, within that group, because we're teenagers and because we're fucking stupid, we usually tease each other with, making fun of like the appearance. So, for example, we had a guy who we called the Tower because, well, he was like fat. He was fat and he had like a dark skin. Or another guy what we'll call Mongol, because he had like kind of like sort of Asian features on him, and so we always treated each other like that along high school, and from what I've seen, always pretty much adults, teenagers, fuck even kids, always treat each other like this, kind of making stuff of very crude stuff. For example, I will say that, for example, in the US, you will probably get detention. You will probably get a call out for that. And if you're from somewhere else, if you're from a different place, I could completely understand you taking this as racism. But yet again, as I said previously, because there isn't a different race as itself, we don't really take that into consideration, If I could say, one of the times that I do remember, at least like being a more popular case or like in the news when it comes to racism, I will say like in CDMX or like Mexico City, pretty much over the south of the country. There was this place, there was this pretty much restaurant, pretty expensive restaurant, over a more gentrified, over a more, high class, high status place. So you had this restaurant that was called, it is called the Sonora Grill. So they had this person that they wouldn't let them take a seat near the window of the restaurant. They will only let them take a seat on like more dark places of the restaurant, or like much more apart from like the main reception. And the reason why they did this again is because it was a more gentrified area. They obviously wanted to give this image to like much more white people, and I mean white people that come from other places, because they have much more money to spend on. So that will definitely be, for example, a thing that I could say that is related more to race, or at least something similar that has happened here. But yet again, much more than racism itself, it's kind of like it's pretty much more a social class, economic status thing. I will say that one of the stuff that I could mention related to this will be the term whitexican. In Mexico here, we use the term whitexican to describe people who, well, first, because they live in places much more, on like much more higher status places, is pretty much all the time closer to the US, at least, well, for example, here in the north of Mexico, because it is close to US, it is normal that you have people with more pale skin, more like white skin, like in the US, for example. So we use the term whitexican to describe people with this appearance, plus an attitude that is more related to being completely alienated to reality on the country, for example. So yeah, I guess I could technically use more examples, but probably Curious doesn't have a lot of time in his video left, and I guess I could talk about more terms such as Rexicans or like alucines, as we call them. But yep, I guess that'd be it from my personal experience. Bye bye.
Listening to marginalized voices is important. But you know what is also important? Thinking critically about what they're saying. So please, by all means, think critically about this video, if you have something you'd like to share. And I do that with other marginalized voices. I'd expect nothing more but the same treatment in return. These two wonderful people were willing to share their own experience. But what is yours? Only if we understand your material reality will we be capable of fighting for a better future for all mankind. Y recuerden, nuestro norte es el sur.